In Seattle, police hope a bloody handprint will finger a killer. But the stain is barely visible. Can investigators bring the evidence into focus? A new computer promises to read a killer's mind. Can it really see the truth locked in the murderer's memory? 2 bodies are found in the California wilds. Clues are spotty and scarce. To bring the killer to light, police rely on a new laser technique. When evidence can't be seen with the naked eye, investigators must use extraordinary means to find it. As technology develops to tease out clues, it's providing detectives with an infallible witness. Forensic science is constantly evolving, from the discovery of the uniqueness of the human fingerprint to the ability to match a criminal to his crime through DNA profiling. Technology continues to provide investigators with new weapons. But fingerprint and DNA evidence are discovered in only 1% of all cases. When trusted techniques fail, investigators must turn to cutting-edge technology to bring invisible clues to light. On the clear spring morning of May 14, 1995, in Kirkland, Washington, just outside Seattle, Randy Acall returned from work and noticed that his neighbor's front door was propped open.
Hello?
Ordinarily, he wouldn't have given it much thought.
Hello?
But he had noticed that the door had been open when he had left for work the night before.
Anybody home?
Randy was a little worried and decided to see if everything was all right.
Hello? Hello?
As he entered the bedroom, a gruesome sight greeted his eyes. He found the body of a woman in her 30s lying in a heap at the foot of the bed. Her head was covered in the top bed sheet, and a t-shirt was bunched up around her neck. Blood stained the carpet beneath her. Horrified, Randy dialed 911.
Yes, I'd like to report an emergency.
Detective T.J. Klump of the Kirkland Police responded to the call.
It was Mother's Day, 1995, at about 10:30 a.m. in the morning. I was preparing to take my wife and daughter out for Mother's Day when, just prior to leaving, I received a call from the Kirkland Dispatch Center, and they requested that I immediately contact Sergeant Markle and the Detective Division that there had been a suspicious death that all the detectives were being called in for to investigate.
When the police reached the apartment, they saw no sign of forced entry. At first glance, there were none of the usual indications that a crime had taken place. The TV, the stereo, and other items of value were still in the condominium. Nothing had been disturbed.
Once I arrived there, and after we had obtained the search warrant, we entered the condominium. And the first thing that struck me was how clean it was for a crime scene. It was very clean, immaculate.
The killer seemed to have been meticulous in covering his tracks. Detectives set about trying to uncover what few clues they could. The case hinged on their ability to bring secrets of the crime scene out into the light. A driver's license was found in a denim purse. The murdered woman was identified as Dawn Faring, a student at the Lutheran Bible Institute who had been living at the condominium for several months. Autopsy evidence, including the body's temperature and its state of rigor mortis, indicated that she had been killed within the last 24 hours. Further test results indicated that the victim had been sexually assaulted, but none of the culprit's DNA was found. The detective and his fellow officers carefully collected evidence from the scene, removing the bed sheets and sections of the blood-stained carpet. They hoped these might contain some clue to the killer's identity. They also found cigarette tobacco and ash near the bed. The victim didn't smoke. They were left by the killer, but were of little use. Another scrap turned up that proved more valuable.
While we were searching the condominium for evidence, we found a box of receipts. And Dawn Faring was a very meticulous person. She was very organized. She saved receipts. She had phone logs. And she had saved some receipts, one of which was a receipt from 5/12 of 95. It was during the late evening hours. She had purchased some groceries at a nearby Fred Meyer's store.
To pinpoint Faring's time of death and to determine whom she might have been with, police went to the grocery store listed on the receipt.
Roxanne, I'd like to show you this picture and see if you recognize this young lady.
A clerk remembered helping the victim. Faring had come in near closing time. She had been friendly and in a good mood, and she had left the store by herself. Along with this information and the evidence gathered from the crime scene, investigators began to piece together the victim's final hours. After leaving the store just before 10 p.m. on May 12th, she apparently went straight home and unpacked her groceries. Putting herself through Bible school, Faring kept track of every penny she spent. She placed her receipt in the box in her hall closet. She then began to bake a pan of brownies, possibly for a Mother's Day celebration the next afternoon. Police estimated it took her an hour to make the brownies. They found them cut and arranged on a plate by the stove. By retracing Faring's steps, investigators arrived at an estimated time of death. Pinning down the time of death narrowed the killer's window of opportunity. But who killed Dawn Faring? Careful scrutiny of the crime scene revealed the faint traces of what might have been finger and palm prints on the bed sheets, traces of the murderer preserved in the victim's own blood. But there was no way to dust or lift the prints from the sheet. Detectives needed to somehow make them clear enough to be useful. The evidence was passed on to King County latent laboratory scientist Pat Warwick.
When we opened up the evidence, we could tell there was some kind of body fluid on the sheet, but any discernible detail, any kind of handprint or anything was very, very difficult.
The print was smeared and faint. No one had ever tried to lift a fingerprint from cloth before, and this one promised to be particularly difficult. Warwick believed his best hope might be to process the prints with amido black, a forensic dye that highlights organic proteins such as blood. But amido black was usually used on hard, non-porous surfaces. Its use on fabric could jeopardize this crucial piece of evidence. Warwick called the FBI for help. but they could offer no advice beyond agreeing that amido black was the best approach. If Warwick used amido black on the sheet fragment, the dye and the rinses in distilled water might well destroy the print. But if the process worked, Warwick would be breaking fresh ground in forensic analysis. Warwick was extremely careful, but it seemed he was not careful enough. When he immersed the fabric in the inky solution, his worst fears were realized. The entire swatch, palm print and all, turned an opaque shade of dark purple. Any hope of getting a legible print seemed lost. In Seattle, authorities investigating the murder of Dawn Faring feared that the only forensic evidence, a palm print, was ruined. Hoping to find another lead, detectives questioned the victim's neighbors. Was this a crime of opportunity? Or was the killer someone Dawn Faring knew and trusted enough to let in her door?
About a year? About a year now, yeah.
While the work of the detectives moved forward, there was a glimmer of hope in Pat Warwick's laboratory. He was relieved to see the excess dye begin to rinse away from the palm print. As he hoped, the amido black dyed the bloodstains purple. But it also stained the fabric light blue, making it difficult to discern the palm print from the weave of the fabric. The confusion of the two patterns made a clear analysis next to impossible. Warwick contacted his colleague, Eric Berg, an expert in the field of digital imaging and enhancement at the Tacoma Police Department.
Yeah, I don't know how good it's going to be, but just let me know, and we'll get down here.
Could Berg's computers and high-tech cameras read the bloody palm print and identify the killer?
Piece of sheet here. Get some amido black on it.
Something here?
There might be something there.
Berg used a digital camera to capture the print. It gave him the flexibility he needed to manipulate and clarify the image. Once he obtained the digital images of the bloody print, he followed strict chain of evidence procedures. The images were tracked with a system that protected them from tampering or accidental alteration.
The software that we use uses the data encryption standard, which is a governmental standard that actually will allow you to mathematically prove that an image or any kind of a digital file has not been altered.
To preserve the original picture, he made copies to work from. Now he was ready to clean up the print. But the image was still in such poor condition, he was not confident he could do much. The ridges of the fingerprint seemed hopelessly tangled with the fabric weave.
Now, at this point, I would put in the source. You could just start to follow a ridge line on the print, and then all of a sudden the weave pattern would come in and disrupt your eye, and you'd go off on a tangent, and you couldn't follow that ridge without constantly being interrupted by the fabric pattern. So the biggest problem was that fabric pattern. We had to find a way to just suppress it or get rid of it somehow, and then look at the print, what was left after that. And if I move my box over here...
Berg used software to filter out the background pattern.
You can see,
while it didn't entirely remove the weave
ridges are
pattern,
coming out of
it
the-
managed to
of the
blur
print.
it, allowing the ridge detail to stand out in clearer relief. But it seemed to Berg that while every step made the image of the bloody print a little clearer, it also created new problems for him to solve. In blurring the fabric pattern, this process significantly reduced the contrast of the image. It remained to be seen whether he could make sense of the print. While Eric Berg struggled to render a clear print, the Kirkland detectives continued to question the victim's neighbors.
I was in a hurry. I had to get off.
So you left for work last night about 9 o'clock?
Right, about 9 o'clock.
The names of 5 men living near the victim's condominium complex came up with prior arrest and fingerprint records. One of these men was Eric Hayden, who lived in the apartment above the victims. When Hayden drove into the condominium parking lot, the detectives were waiting to speak with him.
Well, let's wait until he brings.
I looked over at the driver, who was a white male in his late 20s, and I noticed that he was smoking a cigarette, and he was looking over at us with his eyes, but yet his head remained facing straight ahead. I thought this was kind of suspicious.
Hayden strolled past the officers without acknowledging them and disappeared into his condominium.
We waited a few minutes, and we wanted to see if he would return outside, which he did. He walked back down the stairs and again walked past us, not looking over at us, and was walking directly towards his car. It was at that time I approached him and I said, "Excuse me, are you Eric Hayden?" He said, "Yes, I am." And I asked him if I could ask him a few questions about that night, to which he agreed.
Hayden claimed he'd been out drinking on the night of the murder and knew nothing about it. He had noticed nothing unusual when he came home. He puffed on a cigarette as the conversation began. To the detectives, he seemed nervous.
When you went upstairs, did you notice?
But a case of nerves would never be enough for a conviction if Hayden was the killer. The police still needed solid evidence, and pressure remained heavy on Eric Berg to provide it.
4 or 5 times.
In his lab, he fed the image of the bloody palm print through yet another computer program. This step raised the tonal values of the ridge detail, much like adjusting the contrast on a television screen. Finally, using all his software and expertise, he produced an image clear enough for comparison with the prints of any suspects. Police asked Warwick to check the prints of the 5 men with criminal records who lived near the condo complex, and that included the prints of Eric Hayden.
They gave us the name of Eric Hayden, and we checked our file, and we had some prints of his on file in our agency. So we pulled those for comparison. Well, once you're looking at the comparison and you're making the positive opinion of a match, as a late examiner, there's that short period of time when you're the only one who knows. You know, the detectives don't know, no one knows. And then so it gives you a real sense of accomplishment.
On May 31st, Pat Warwick called the detectives and told them he had made a positive match. The prints on the bedsheet did indeed match the prints of Eric Hayden. That same night, the Kirkland detectives went to Hayden's condominium to execute a search warrant.
Officers, open the door.
Eric Hayden, we have a warrant for your arrest. Lay down, face down on the deck.
Going forward.
Hayden was handcuffed and arrested.
What's going on?
His apartment was searched top to bottom, and his girlfriend was questioned.
Ma'am, I'm Detective Plum.
He was charged with first-degree murder.
The arrest of Eric Hayden.
After Hayden's arrest, police began to piece together a picture of the gruesome events of May 12, 1995.
Yes?
They speculated that Eric Hayden had gained entry to the victim's home, probably through some false pretense. A brutal assault and murder followed shortly thereafter. At some point, Hayden lingered over his victim, enjoying a cigarette. He placed it on the night table and covered the victim with a sheet. He then wiped his bloody hands on the sheet. As he left the scene, one of the victim's slippers jammed in the door, propping it open. It had been the open door that first attracted attention to the crime scene. Though the suspect was in custody and evidence strongly linked him to the crime, Detective Klomp's case was not airtight. Hayden's lawyers asserted that the digital technology was too new to be relied upon at the trial. They argued that the enhanced images might have been altered or tampered with. Any new forensic technology undergoes intense legal and scientific scrutiny.
Hold it right there.
Hundreds of cases have been lost through improper evidence handling procedures. At the heart of the defense team's argument was their view that a virtual image might falsely incriminate a very real and innocent man.
Some amino black on it.
Had Hayden's attorneys been successful in this challenge, losing those prints as evidence would have seriously damaged the prosecution's case. But Eric Berg took extra care to explain the process to the members of the jury and to let them decide for themselves.
We took this into court, we took the equipment with us, we set it up, we took the sheet that we originally received from King County, and we actually captured the image in court, brought it into the computer, performed all of the steps that we had done, and printed out the image, and we were able to show the jury that everything we did there is the same as what we did before, and the result is the same, and it's repeatable.
Satisfied that Berg's digital enhancement techniques were sound, credible, repeatable, and damning, the jury needed only 3 hours to return their verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree.
This technology was incredible. It helped us solve the case much faster than we would have been able to having just gone out and contacting people or waiting for additional information to come in. This left no doubt in anyone's mind that this was the killer. It positively identified the killer.
Those prints, which had seemed to be just smudges at first, had finally yielded their secrets to the new digital imaging technology. Ultimately, they betrayed Eric Hayden to justice. Hayden left behind his handprint, thinking it was an illegible smudge. He didn't know that computer enhancement could turn that faint residue into a clear picture of guilt. Other criminals take greater pains to conceal the traces of their crimes, but the remnants of murder aren't so easy to hide. Forensics has ways of flushing them out. On a frigid January morning in 1987, a fur trapper was checking his traps in the blizzard-bound Cactus Flats region of California's Big Bear. It was hard going in such miserable weather. At about 11 that morning, he noticed a large oblong object covered in the new blanket of snow. There in the wilderness lay an abandoned mattress. The strange find seemed innocuous enough, but as the trapper checked around it, he made a macabre discovery. He hurried to the nearest telephone and summoned the police. Homicide Sergeant Gary Stroop of the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department responded to the call.
When we got there, it was just starting to snow again, and it's probably about 18 degrees. So we were trying to do the scene as fast as we could so we could get out of there before we got stranded.
Beneath the mattress lay two bodies, a man and a woman, both murdered. Stroop found that in one way the weather had worked in his favor. The cold had protected the bodies against decomposition. He was also fortunate to find the bodies intact.
Check down there. See if there's anything.
There's a lot of animal activity up there. There's bears, mountain lions, coyotes, you name it. Had the weather been warmer, we probably would have had animal activity on the bodies.
Footprints, anything?
But who were the victims? Who had taken their lives?
tell you one thing.
The only clues at the scene were the victims and the mattress. The man had some distinctive tattoos that resembled the kind worn by convicts.
I see blood down there.
The detectives tried to identify him by checking prison records.
Homicide, Sergeant Stroop.
Sergeant Stroop's hunch about the tattoos paid off. The fingerprints taken from the man matched those of an ex-convict named Richard Crisson.
Yeah.
The woman was identified as his girlfriend, Shanna Thole.
Yeah, no, just...
Autopsy evidence showed that both victims had died of multiple shotgun blasts. Through prison records, detectives were able to locate and question Richard Crisson's family. Crisson's brother told police that Richard and Shanna had gone to Victorville to see a man by the name of Archie Woods.
Richie and Shanna. Yeah, Officer Barnes, I called you earlier.
According to the brother, Crisson dealt drugs for Woods, who was a motorcycle gang member. This information, along with a background check of Woods, made him the detective's prime suspect. The police paid a visit to Archie Woods. His house lay in a secluded area 20 miles from where the victims were found. Woods wasn't at home. The detectives were greeted by Archie's girlfriend, Sherry Mills. She told the officer she didn't know where he was, but reluctantly agreed to let them in. Even before they entered Archie Woods' home, a possible clue caught their eye. On the front porch, beside the door, they found two spots that appeared to be blood. The stains could have been nothing, or they could have been the clue that would break the case wide open. It was too soon to tell. The detectives hoped to find the answer inside. Police investigating the deaths of Richard Crisson and Shanna Thole chased the only lead they had. At the home of drug dealer Archie Woods, they sought any clues they could find.
What time did Richard and Sean leave, still awake?
The detectives informed Woods' girlfriend, Sherry Mills, that they were told Shanna and Richard had visited the house.
You had some friends over?
Mills admitted that Crisson and Thole had indeed been there, but only to spend the night on their way somewhere else.
Yeah, so who was it last
She had no idea of their destination.
Well, it was our friend Rich and,
Inside the house, detectives saw more brown spots that resembled blood. The house smelled of fresh paint. In the back bedroom, they found several paint cans. There was no sign of a mattress. If the murders occurred in this bedroom, police suspected that the paint covered crucial evidence. Police needed a way to see beneath it to look for evidence of a murder. It was the only way they could connect the homicides to this potential crime scene. They ordered a search warrant and then notified the crime scene unit that they had a difficult problem to solve. In the yard, officers noticed several wide, low-profile tire tracks, consistent with those made by a sports car. The woman victim, Shanna Thole, was last seen driving her high-performance sports car. The obvious bloodstains were examined, and the visible evidence was collected. Even so, the police were stymied. If the blood found at the house matched Thole and Crisson's, it could be explained as coming from a fistfight. There was not enough blood in plain sight to prove murder with a shotgun. It seemed as though the entire investigation had literally hit a wall. Forensic expert David Stockwell of the Sheriff's Scientific Investigation Division thought an alternative light source might reveal evidence hidden behind the paint in Wood's house. The alternate light source, or ALS, is a variable intensity laser beam typically used to highlight body fluid evidence on clothing or at a crime scene. Various fluids reflect specific frequencies of light. By adjusting the frequency of the laser, invisible evidence can be seen. Forensic technicians use tinted goggles and reflection-enhancing chemicals to make trace body fluids glow under the laser beam. Here, simulated bloody footprints become too faint to see with the naked eye. But with the right chemicals sprayed on them, and with the laser of the ALS set at the proper frequency, they fluoresce. In theory, at least, blood evidence could be made to glow, even from behind a coat of paint. But it would take the precise combination of chemicals, goggle tints, and laser frequencies to penetrate the painted layer.
The ALS is very good at picking up certain biological fluids, such as semen, but is not typically used to find blood because blood in itself is usually visible to the naked eye. What we were doing with the ALS was to see through that opaque layer of paint to see underneath it and what was there.
But would it work in such an unorthodox application at the home of Archie Woods? Police in San Bernardino had never used an ALS in this manner before. It was not built to illuminate an entire wall. They had to slowly comb small areas, hoping that the light could see through the paint and reveal any evidence beneath.
Okay, Richard, take your goggles off.
Little by little, they succeeded. With the ALS, the grim events at the Woods house were brought to light. There on the wall, beneath the fresh paint, was a wide splash pattern of darkened blood that had been all but invisible to the naked eye. This was the breakthrough police hoped for. They could now read the stain patterns on the wall to determine what happened. As shown here with this colored fluid, blood shed in violence can behave in several ways. It can drip, making a circular spot. Its diameter depends on how far and how much of the blood has fallen. It can form a series of streaks when flung off an object, such as a knife slashing through the air. This is called casting off. But another, equally telling kind of bloodstain appeared on Archie Wood's wall.
The largest of all bloodstains that I've ever seen at crime scenes are produced by what is called arterial spurting. And in this case, what I was seeing underneath the paint on the wall was in fact the bloodstain size consistent with arterial spurting.
The spurting patterns on the wall were consistent with the location of the wounds found on Chrisen and Thole. The ALS painted a grim picture of their violent death. The next problem was how to preserve the bloodstains for use as evidence in court. Without proof positive of arterial spurting, a shrewd defense team might claim that only a fistfight had taken place in that room, not a murder, and certainly not two murders. The ALS had illuminated the evidence bit by bit, but now the laser had to shine on the entire wall in order to take a photograph.
Hey, George, look around. Richard. Why do I call you George?
Investigators used a technique called painting with light.
Yeah.
While the camera shutter was held open, the ALS was shown on the wall from left to right and top to bottom until the entire wall had been recorded through the course of several minutes. When the negatives were developed, they provided a clear, admissible picture of what the ALS revealed. That was good news for Sergeant Stroop.
With the pattern that we had on that wall with the use of the laser, it was obvious it was high velocity and a large amount of it, much more so than you'd ever have gotten from somebody with a bloody nose or getting beat up.
The evidence of violent death in that fateful room was mounting. The exposed blood patterns revealed that at the time they were shot, Shanna Thole and Richard Chrisen were lying in the bed, presenting no potential threat to their assailant. Meanwhile, their alleged killer was still at large.
That's what I was saying.
Okay. All right.
In San Bernardino, the search for Archie Woods, suspected of killing Richard Crisson and Shanna Thole, took on new urgency.
He's making a call right now.
To avoid being implicated in the killings, Wood's girlfriend cooperated with authorities.
No, he left a little bit later.
She disclosed to
he
the
had to go to
detectives
Kmart
that
and get
Archie
some
was in
parts for his car.
Modesto,
He's gonna work
visiting his little girl on her birthday.
So Richard and Shauna were already gone by the time he...
On Friday, the day Detective Stroop was gathering evidence at Archie's home, Archie himself was already under arrest in a neighboring county for carrying a concealed weapon in his car. He was driving a sports car at the time. Shanna Thole's sports car. From his cell in the San Bernardino jail, Woods maintained his innocence in the double homicide. He claimed that the murders were committed by members of his motorcycle gang. According to Woods, on the night of the murder, gang members asked Woods to lure Richard Crisson to his home. Woods claimed that after Crisson and Thole had arrived, he left his house as the gang instructed. Woods refused to identify the gang members involved.
Archie stuck with his story that he did not know who the other people were that had come into the house, that they were alive when he left and dead when he came back. But he would not ever give up the names of the other individuals that were involved.
Archie Woods said that he had then panicked and dumped the bodies in Big Bear. But with the help of the ALS, the police discovered the crucial piece of trace blood evidence that shot holes in Archie's story. The reclined position of the victims, as indicated by the bloodstains on the wall, just didn't add up to a violent confrontation. Detectives pieced together a likely scenario for the events of that night. Crisson and Thole had come to Archie's home to settle a dispute over a drug deal gone wrong. There was a long night of discussion and argument.
We gotta do something. I mean, he's got all this stuff, right?
Apparently, the disagreement was not resolved to Archie's satisfaction. But he let Crisson and Thole think an accord had been reached. The couple went to bed, unaware of the heavy price that Archie planned to exact from them that night. Police believe that when he thought they were sound asleep, Woods struck his helpless victims, taking their lives with blast after blast from a shotgun. Woods' one true statement was that he had dumped the bodies and the blood-soaked bedding in Big Bear, thinking no one would ever find them. Back at his house, he had first tried to clean the wall, but the blood wouldn't come off. He then covered the evidence with a thick coat of paint. But the alternate light source defied his efforts to conceal his crime. It clearly showed the pattern of the bloodstains through the opaque coat.
You know, when looking at that, there's no doubt in my mind they were killed here. They were in this bed. And, you know, that's going to show everybody, you know, what we know, or help us prove what we know, or convince a jury of what we know. And it did.
Archie Woods was given 2 life sentences for the double murder of Richard Crisson and Shanna Thole. Every criminal leaves evidence behind. The key is to know how to find it. But the most compelling evidence is also the least tangible. It's the criminal's knowledge of his actions. A new technique is testing a way of tapping the suspect's mind to turn a criminal's own memory against him. Larry Farwell is the director and chief scientist of the Human Brain Research Laboratory in Fairfield, Iowa. He has developed a new computerized system known as brain fingerprinting. It reads the memory centers of the human brain. He believes that brain fingerprinting will one day be used to positively link perpetrators to their crimes.
Brain fingerprinting is a scientific method of determining whether certain information is stored in a brain or is not stored in the brain. If an individual has committed a crime, he'll have certain information relevant to that crime stored in his brain. So we can use brain fingerprinting to determine scientifically whether he committed the crime or not.
When someone commits a crime, his brain records it as a memory. Brain fingerprinting seeks to reveal that memory by showing the suspect evidence taken from the crime scene.
Now I'm going to be putting this headband on your head.
A headband with sensors is placed on the subject. A series of pictures or words is flashed on the screen. The computer records the brain waves produced in response to what the subject sees. The responses are recorded as a waveform. By analyzing the pattern of waves, Farwell can determine if the subject is recognizing what he's seeing.
So when you have a situation where a crime is committed, there are certain details about the crime that only the criminal would know, then you can test, does this brain have those details stored in it? If so, then the individual committed the crime. If not, then not.
The FBI is at the forefront of developing and evaluating new technology. After hearing of Farwell's system, they put it to the test. The FBI tested brain fingerprinting on their own agents at the Bureau's training facility at Quantico, Virginia.
We conducted a study on FBI agents, and the purpose of this study was to see if we could determine whether an individual is an FBI agent or not based on his or her brainwaves. If we can determine an FBI agent, then we could determine whether somebody is an agent of some, say, foreign intelligence organization or a criminal group, just based on their brain responses.
Each subject was presented with a series of words on a computer screen. Many were FBI acronyms or terms familiar only to agents. The FBI agents were specifically told to do everything they could to conceal from Farwell that they were in any way connected with the Bureau. The participants' brain response to each stimulus was measured by electrodes on a headband. The electrodes were wired to the brainwave analysis software of Farwell's system.
So what we did is to present stimuli, phrases, that only an FBI agent, because of their training, would know, mixed in with others. The FBI agents recognized them. We picked up the brain responses. We knew that they were FBI agents.
The principle behind the brain fingerprinting system is very simple. Farwell has discovered that the memory centers of the human brain respond to the sight of familiar stimuli with a distinct change in electrical activity. He calls this change a murmur.
And that is the specific brain response that we measure, that we analyze with a computer, in order to determine whether an individual recognizes the words or pictures that we flashed on the screen that are relevant to the crime or to whatever it is that we're investigating.
When the subject sees anything on the screen, it creates a pattern of brain activity. A murmur is increased brain activity produced when the subject recognizes what he's seeing.
This headband will measure the electrobrain
The test participants who did not work for the FBI did not recognize the specific FBI stimuli, so no murmurs were detected.
Some of them relevant to the FBI and some of them not.
Researchers with the United States Navy also heard the claims made about the system. They devised a test of their own to see if brain fingerprinting could distinguish military medical students from civilians. They used a list of acronyms specific to medicine and the military. Lieutenant Commander Rene Hernandez conducted the test.
The test was 100% accurate. They were able to tell each and every one. The trick with this is not so much if the technique works properly. The trick is if you ask the right questions. Because if they had not come up with a group of really good acronyms that only the students would know, then they wouldn't be able to determine the difference between the medical students and the staff, for example. So the trick is in being clever enough to ask the correct questions, because the brain will always answer it honestly.
Careful preparation of the words or pictures for a session is vital for accurate, useful results. The questions must be phrased in such a way that when a murmur occurs, it is clear why. In a murder investigation, both a witness to a shooting and the shooter might show a murmur when confronted with the murder weapon.
You have two people, only one person actually committed the crime. You have another person who simply saw it. They have the same information in their brain, so you have to get that, you have to ask the questions properly.
Rigorously constructed lab tests are one thing, but how would the brain fingerprinting system work on the front lines of a murder investigation? Could Dr. Farwell's computer read the mind of an actual killer? Like a page torn from a science fiction novel, brain fingerprinting might be the next century's most powerful new forensic tool. No criminal's secrets would be safe when his own brain waves could bring him to justice. Captain Blaine Corral, commander of the Investigations Division of the Alexandria, Virginia Police, has also tested the system. Though he was initially skeptical about its use in the real world, he was quickly won over.
The vision I had was like of the Three Stooges with a salad bowl sitting on the top of someone's head with wires coming out of it. And I thought, not only would this technique or this technology never really be useful, but there's no way in the world it would ever be accepted by the law enforcement community.
Corral compared brain fingerprinting with the polygraph, the lie detector used by law enforcement for many years. The polygraph is still not admissible in court, but has become a standard tool to guide police.
The polygraph works on the theory that you can't control your heart rate or something called your galvanic skin response or your breathing patterns. The brain fingerprinting sort of takes that a step further and recognizes the fact that you can't control the electrical activity in your brain.
A polygraph registers only stress or emotional responses, such as heart and respiration rates and sweating. By analyzing the readings, the operator tries to discern whether a subject is being truthful or deceptive in his answers. But in some cases, the polygraph can be fooled. Brain fingerprinting is often more general. It can identify the presence of hidden information in persons fraudulently claiming either knowledge or ignorance of certain facts. But again, it reveals only the presence of the information, not the details.
So they're going to both help us toward the same end, which is ultimately to find out the truth about what we're investigating and formulate the best case for presentation in court, but they're going to sort of attack it from different angles. Both can be very crucial to a successful case.
Serious questions remain about the wholesale application of Dr. Farwell's invention. Would a murmur be revealed if a killer were in a drunken blackout or a psychotic state when he took his victim's life? In such cases, there might not be a brain fingerprint after the fact. What if right after he committed the crime, the killer received a severe head trauma?
But that's what actually happened with the the person who was the bodyguard who was in the car with Princess Diana. Everybody thinks he's trying to cover up something. He had such a severe traumatic injury, he probably will never remember that because the brain never was healthy enough to store that information into long-term memory.
In most cases, brain fingerprinting a witness or an accomplice can reveal knowledge of all kinds of crime, from espionage to terrorist plots. At least that's the promise of this technology. Brain fingerprinting is not yet admissible in the United States, but it might be only a matter of time before it becomes a routine tool. The relatively new technique of DNA profiling is known to be so dead-on accurate that genetic evidence is readily accepted. Ultimately, scientists and criminal investigators agree that brain fingerprinting shows great potential in murder investigations. In a shooting death with no witnesses, the killer would be the only person with intimate knowledge of the crime. With Dr. Farwell's computer, the murderer's own brain could become a witness for the prosecution. Technology is providing new ways to reveal evidence that would have been lost or unavailable just a few years ago. Today, investigators can peer beneath paint, lift a smudged palm print from a bedsheet, and perhaps even tap into a suspect's memory to find the truth. There may be no way to completely stop crime, but forensic science is finding ever more ingenious tactics to catch criminals. In Pittsburgh, 3 firefighters die in the line of duty, bringing new urgency to the search for the cause of a mysterious blaze. 2 suspicious fires strike East Baltimore in the same week. Perplexed investigators try to draw a connection. To catch an arson suspect, investigators in Reno must rely on evidence from the crime scene. But what kind of clues could survive the 1400-degree inferno? When fire strikes, it's sudden, unexpected, and rampant, consuming almost everything in its path. But through forensics, arson investigators can piece together what's left and raise the truth from the ashes. Some fires start purely by accident. Others only seem that way. It's the investigator's job to tell the difference. In 1995, the urban landscape of East Baltimore was plagued by a series of mysterious fires. In July, firefighters arrived at 1311 Rose Street to find the row house completely engulfed. No one was living there, but the fire claimed 1 casualty. A vagrant had taken shelter that night in an upstairs bedroom. The intrusion cost him his life. The Rose Street fire was the second lethal fire in the neighborhood in days. Less than a week earlier, neighbors reported a blast that tore apart a narrow building a few blocks away on Lombard Street. Bricks and debris flew 50 feet from the explosion. a woman who lived next door went into cardiac arrest as a result of the explosion and later died of complications. The Baltimore police and fire departments called in the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to examine the suspicious fires. Agent James Tanda led the investigation for the ATF.
This was a massive explosion. These are 3-story brick row homes on Lombard Street that are contained on both sides. This unit happens to be in the middle of the block, and when it exploded, the entire building collapsed, and the fire was devastating. If there was anybody else in there other than the arsonist that day, they would have never survived this.
2 suspicious fires, 2 structures reduced to rubble in the span of a few days. The ATF suspected they may have been connected to something bigger. Over the past few years, 13 fires in nearby buildings racked up more than $2 million in damage.
I think it was just...
Yeah, it was committed.
Now that fires had claimed 2 lives, the investigation took on new urgency.
Any kind of odors or anything noticed?
Fearing they were dealing with a serial arsonist, the ATF and the Baltimore Police Arson Squad sought to determine whether these blazes had been intentionally set and if any connection could be drawn between them. Baltimore arson investigator Mark Profili, a criminalist with the Baltimore Police, was assigned the case.
People wonder oftentimes how you can take a bunch of rubble and find evidence, and we believe that fire doesn't destroy evidence, rather it creates it. So Bob, we're gonna need some shots in here.
Okay. This is where the guy's body was found, Sal.
The victim of the Rose Street fire succumbed to smoke inhalation in an upstairs bedroom.
Face down on the floor, head toward the back door, the back window. Okay.
But the fire had come from below and worked its way to the second floor. The investigative team's objective was to find out exactly where it started. Fire always marks its path. Smoke and burn patterns are the first clue at any scene. As the flames move through a building, they leave distinct patterns, which can lead a trained eye to the point of origin.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Investigators need to know where a fire started before they can determine what caused it.
Carpet, it was a big fire.
Ready for a new angle?
Yeah. Point of origin is that area of the fire, the exact point where the 3 elements of a fire would come in together. That would be fuel, heat, and oxygen. And that would be the area, from a forensic standpoint, that we would look for the physical evidence of flammable liquid residues being poured.
What investigators found when they examined the floor was a circular area that had been burned much deeper than the surrounding wood. The pattern suggested that this was the point of origin.
One, I can even say this suggests the person taking the gasoline and
The wood
pouring
had
it.
been soaked with a flammable liquid, an accelerant, at this spot.
Making her the hard edge burning where the alligatoring effect of the wood stops is a good area to collect samples. This sort of defines where the pour would start and finish. Also, the burn through and the tongue and grooves would show us that probably a flammable liquid was poured here. What makes me believe even stronger that it's a flammable liquid is if you can follow, you see the damage when the floor comes around and goes out, spreads all the way across here, which to me suggests that perhaps our arsonist poured some flammable liquid, small amount here, walked towards the front door, threw the flammable liquid in a large area, sets the can wherever, lights his match, and exits.
As the investigation continued at Rose Street, the ATF called in a specialist. Tipper, a dog trained to sniff out traces of accelerant, set to work. She helps investigators identify similarities between arson fires by locating where flammable liquid was poured. With With a sense of smell 200 times more sensitive than the human nose, these dogs can pinpoint minute traces of accelerant.
Where's it at? Find it. See here. Yeah, girl. See here. Good girl. See here. See here.
This drastically reduces the time needed to test samples collected randomly.
Where's it at? Over here. Good girl. Good girl. Sneak. Come here. Get here. Get here. Here.
When Tipper finds what she's looking for, she sits down and puts her nose onto the most saturated spot,
Good work. Good work. That's good work.
telling investigators precisely what evidence to gather. Samples are then collected for analysis.
Okay. Fingers. Okay. Cut that up so we can fit her in the can. That's perfect.
Accelerants ignite with devastating ease, but are reluctant to burn away. If the wood hasn't burned to ash, traces of the vapor will remain locked inside.
Pine. This pine right now.
Water from the fire hose actually seals it inside the material.
In these scenes, we collected burned wood from the points of origin of the fires. We also collected any burned pieces of wood or clear pieces of wood that Tipper, the canine, hit on. Okay.
Sections of wood are carved from the remains, placed into paint cans, and firmly sealed to prevent evaporation. Oddly, Tipper kept hitting on a portion of the hallway that didn't appear to have been affected by the fire. Samples from this spot were sent with the other samples to the Baltimore ATF lab. In the lab, evidence cans are pierced and a pipette filled with activated charcoal is inserted. If accelerant is present in the sample, it is absorbed by the charcoal as it vaporizes. The charcoal is then tested for any traces of accelerant. Analysis confirmed that gasoline had fueled the Rose Street fire. Samples collected throughout the house showed that it wasn't just splashed lightly about. The arsonist had probably thought that more gas meant a bigger blaze. But that's not the way fire works. Though the arsonist had accomplished his goal, he was not an expert in the ways of fire.
You have to have that fuel-air mixture correct for the fire to burn at its peak as best it could, and they just put too much gasoline in. They didn't have, maybe not enough windows open, maybe something, but they just had too much in here.
One of the biggest clues was the unburned patch of floor found by Tipper. The ATF found traces of accelerant, but it was faint and far from where the blaze occurred.
Show me.
Someone had tried to torch this building before.
Show me better. Good girl.
Could Tipper's curious finding put investigators on the trail of an arson ring?
See? See?
In the center room.
Tipped off by their canine specialist, investigators discovered that 1311 Rose Street had burned before.
Jim and I was on.
2 years earlier, the building's owner, Robert Milligan, had received several $1,000s on a fire insurance claim.
Any money on this?
No, not to my knowledge.
Baltimore police interviewed Milligan, a businessman who owned and operated a number of low-income rental units.
Serious as far as how?
Well, it doesn't appear to have been normal.
He told the investigators that the fires may have been set by his tenants, who were angry over recent eviction notices.
Quite a coincidence.
Meanwhile, an investigation into the explosion on Lombard Street indicated that it too was oversaturated with gasoline. But in this case, the gasoline was spread with a bug sprayer found at the scene. The high concentration of aerosol gas is what caused the explosion.
That's where the dog hit up here.
It seemed the arsonist had tried to refine his technique.
It looked almost like a trail.
The Baltimore Police Department's arson squad questioned residents, hoping to locate a suspect.
Officer Sinclair, Baltimore Police Department.
Nice to see you. Are you telling them about what happened?
Residents of Rose Street reported that they had been evicted just before the fire broke out. Neighbors near the Lombard Street explosion saw men moving furniture and files from an office in the doomed building, then moving in cheaper desks and cabinets. The more questions the police asked, the more suspicious and similar the fires became.
My house was on fire, just like you knocked on my door. It was on fire.
Looking through fire department records, detectives learned that too much gasoline had also been used to start a fire on nearby Bradford Street in June 1995, on Gough Street in April 1995, and on Linwood Avenue in October 1994.
Chances are they came all the way over to the... They were paid over
13 similar arsons had occurred in a 2-mile radius in the past 2 years. Every fire fit the same profile. Too much gasoline poured in the middle of the floor.
From the time they did Gough Street, it was in April of '95, until Bradford Street was just 2 months. It was April to June. And then from Bradford Street to Rose Street was within days. They actually literally went from June 28th to July 1st to July 4th to July 10th. So in a 2-week period, they did 5 arsons and attempted to do 5 more.
Besides their location and their fate, on the surface, the buildings had little in common. They were owned by different people. Months after the spree of fires ended, investigators hadn't closed in on a suspect, but they felt confident that all 13 arsons had been motivated by the same individuals. Now they had to find them.
And what we tried to do was draw a link between this and all of the other scenes, and we were able to do that through their lab. We were able to find consistencies in how each one was initiated, as well as the accelerant that was used from scene to scene was all consistent.
If this were an arson-for-profit scheme, it would take a massive paper chase to uncover it. Police and ATF started with a background check on Robert Milligan, owner of the Rose Street property. They learned he was in deep financial trouble. His businesses and rental properties were failing. His debt exceeded $60,000. Investigators researched every property that Milligan had ever owned. The names of known criminals kept cropping up as his business partners. The next step was to find out if any of these other men had buildings that burned. Using bank statements, corporate records, and fire department, police, and insurance reports, investigators slowly pieced together a string of insurance payoffs that linked Milligan and his business partners to all 13 fires. But who was actually striking the match? The investigation revealed that one of Milligan's business associates was recently imprisoned for robbery. Agents went to the Maryland Correctional Institution to interview him. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he admitted his involvement in the arson-for-profit scheme. He named another business associate, Paul Beber as the torch. Beber had been injured in the Lombard Street explosion, he said. The informant told police that Beber had modified his usual pattern, using a bug sprayer to saturate the Lombard Street house. He thought it would be a quick job, but he underestimated its power and was temporarily trapped in the flames. Beber managed to escape and flee with the help of Robert Milligan's brother, Gary.
Crawled out of the rubble with second and third degree burns and crawled back through the alley to the awaiting getaway car. At that point, Gary Milligan then picked him up and took him back to his house where they tried to doctor him before he went to the emergency room.
As soon as Beber was released from the hospital, he went into hiding.
This is where the witness saw
He was eventually flushed out, apprehended, and arrested.
To the getaway vehicle. He was surprised, very surprised that he was caught, that it was over. He was very surprised. He had been running for so long and had led a life of crime since he was 16 years old, that at the age of 32 to be apprehended knowing that he was charged now with arson, conspiracy, attempted murder, and a bunch of other crimes, he knew his life was essentially over.
To close the case, the ATF had to find a way to link Robert Milligan to the arson scheme. A sting was set up. In this surveillance video, he's discussing the arson with his former business associate, who cooperated with authorities under condition of anonymity.
Everything's cool, right? With me? Yeah. I mean, can you find out with Bundy if anybody knows anything about me, or if anybody's coming to see me?
Listen to me carefully. They told Paul that they know that I'm the mastermind behind it all.
It was all the ATF needed.
We pay rent. We ain't going nowhere. I don't care. No.
Police learned that Milligan hired men to evict his tenants a week before the Rose Street blaze. Once he was certain the house was clear, Beber set the fire. Milligan didn't count on a vagrant becoming trapped in the building. Milligan even had police on his payroll to ensure that his people would not be caught. But in the end, his arson-for-profit ring collapsed. In November of 1996, federal indictments charged Milligan and his 5 co-conspirators for their roles in one of the largest serial arson-for-profit cases in Maryland history. By April of 1997, all the defendants had pleaded guilty to arson, conspiracy, and federal firearms violations. The judge doled out stiff sentences, ranging from 17 to 24 years in federal prison. Milligan and his associates tried to cover their tracks, hoping that the power of the fire would destroy any link to them. But forensics had connected the 13 seemingly unrelated fires with the people who masterminded them. Had it not been for good police work and effective lab analysis, their elaborate arson ring might have never been exposed. Other arsonists are less methodical, but catching them can be equally challenging. On November 18, 1992, firefighters from the Reno, Nevada Fire Department were called to a large fire. The blaze tore through the Mental Health Medical Association building. It took firefighters more than 10 hours to conquer the blaze. The fire destroyed the 3-story building and the expensive medical equipment inside. The intensity of the fire seemed suspicious. Forensic investigator William Stevenson was called in to photograph and examine the wreckage.
This would be one of the first photographs taken at the scene. It's an aerial photograph of the actual building itself. The area just to the west of this porch, or towards the residence itself, was the area that the fire investigators indicated was the possible point of origin for this fire.
Once the fire had been extinguished and the building declared safe, Fire Inspector Bill Burney explored the aftermath. He suspected an accelerant had been used.
And I thought it was highly unusual to have so much water on the porch to see flames burning on top of the water.
A typical house fire burns around 800 degrees. But judging from the burn patterns and amount of damage, temperatures at the entryway reached 1,400 degrees. Neither an electrical fire nor spontaneous combustion from oily rags would have produced these patterns. They were clearly signs of an accelerant. They included a well-defined pore pattern and severe alligatoring, indications of intense heat in a short time. Burney and Stevenson looked for something to link the arsonist to the crime scene. Despite Stevenson's careful documentation of the fire damage, no compelling clues surfaced.
The destructive capabilities of the fire had actually burned up a lot of evidence. And when I left the scene that day, we had virtually no physical evidence to connect a suspect to that scene.
That wasn't surprising. The intensity of the blaze made it impossible for firefighters to enter the building, so the order came to flood it from the outside. After a 10-hour dousing with thousands of gallons of pressurized water, most of the accelerant had been washed away. Investigators focused their attention on the front door, the apparent epicenter of the blaze. Near it was a shattered window. Burney suspected that was where the arsonist poured the accelerant.
I determined that the point of entry, how the fire was set, is the suspect used a flammable liquid container, probably a 2-gallon or 5-gallon gasoline, and broke a window and used this motion to pour gasoline through this window, therefore possibly cutting the back of their hand or some portion of their hands.
If Burney was correct, then whoever broke the window may have been cut in the process. Could the arsonist have left blood at the scene? It seemed unlikely. Even if he had been badly injured, the evidence would have been washed away or covered with grime. While the investigators scoured the building for clues, their big break came from across town. Investigators Burney and Stevenson were frustrated by the lack of evidence at the Mental Health Association building in Reno.
Fire started way down here low, so that's another indicator.
But just as they finished their inspection, they learned about a shooting at a mental health facility in another part of the city. Doctors who had offices in the burned building also worked in this facility. From interviews with personnel, the investigators zeroed in on a suspect in the shooting. James Thomas Manassas, a 57-year-old cab driver who lived 5 blocks from the fire. His wife, a psychiatric patient, was institutionalized at the facility.
Stronger if she's home with me.
He believed that after 2 years, she was only getting worse.
She has been making great strides.
I want her to come home. Calm down. She has to come home with
Growing
me.
frustrated, he directed his anger at the doctors, whom he considered responsible for his wife's decline.
No, I'll take care of her.
Calm down, sir.
I will take
You're
care of
upsetting
you.
your wife.
He demanded that his wife be released, or he threatened to take matters into his own hands. Doctors refused. For nearly 2 years before the fire, Manassas continued pressuring doctors about his wife's care.
You know, I'm sorry, you cannot see her tonight. You know when visiting hours
According to
are?
one of the psychiatrists, Manassas made death threats and promised to burn down the building.
You understand. You know the rules.
No, I would like to see my wife tonight.
Everything all right, Dr. Keel? Waving that gun around.
On November 18th, just 5 hours after the arson at the mental health offices, someone had fired 2 shots through the windows of the mental health facility, wounding 2 doctors. Whoever fired the shots fled without being seen.
From where you were standing, what did you see?
Police decided to take a closer look at James Manassas.
Standing in front of me.
Municipal center, and we'll make a report that
Officers went to his house and found him bleeding heavily.
Up on Cleveland Street.
Both of his hands were severely lacerated.
To Cleveland.
He was brought to police headquarters for questioning. Manassas claimed that he was wounded with a knife during a mugging the previous night.
So you really...
We went out to this location in order to try and verify the fact that he had indeed been attacked here and look for possible physical evidence of that attack. When we arrived at the area, we did a very close examination and we did not find any blood anywhere around this particular location.
Yeah, that's a nice picture there. Let's get a shot of that.
Armed with a search warrant, investigators returned to his house. They found a streak of blood on his car door and several spots of blood inside the vehicle.
Your kind of stuff here.
In the house, they found that Manassas had made no effort to conceal the copious amounts of blood.
Oh, we got some blood here. Get a shot of this.
In the kitchen, they found blood at the bottom of a bucket. In the bedroom, they uncovered bloody pants and a bloody towel.
Oh, yeah.
Given his suspicious wounds, weak alibi, and ardent threats against the mental health care facilities, the police felt they had enough cause to arrest him. Bernie and Stevenson believed they had the arsonist in custody, but they knew that they didn't have the kind of physical evidence that would assure his conviction. There had been no eyewitnesses to the crime, and no accelerant was found on the suspect's clothing. But his wounds raised suspicions.
In reality, Reno PD detectives believe that these lacerations were actually caused by the action of the broken window glass to his fingers at the fire at the point of origin.
Set fire inside the building on his way out.
The only physical evidence to connect him with the scene of the fire would be blood from his wounds, if it survived the inferno. Stevenson was familiar with a laboratory technique in which bloody fingerprints are baked to stabilize them. Was it possible that a viable droplet of blood had been preserved by the intense heat and survived the water and soot?
Right by his left foot all the way over to the door.
It was a long shot, but at this point, it was all they had.
Because of all of the hundreds of thousands of gallons of water that had been used on that fire, the actual damage by the heat and flames, damage by the char and the residue, and the items falling from the ceiling and such, we were a bit skeptical as to whether we would find some blood evidence at that scene.
If there was any blood at the scene, it would have been baked into the concrete. The investigators removed 6 inches of burned debris. Then they gently washed down the front porch. As layers of wreckage were moved, a series of brown droplets that appeared to be blood became visible. A marker was placed on each drop. The blood droplets led from the shattered glass down the porch steps. Not knowing how much of the blood would yield helpful information, they collected as much of it as they could. Removing the samples wasn't easy. Normally, blood is collected with moistened cotton swabs, but these droplets were much less accessible. The team had to use a scalpel to scrape it from the concrete. The only hope of catching an arsonist was to find his signature in these charred flakes of blood.
There it is.
The blood samples collected from the burned steps of the mental health building were sent to the Washoe County Sheriff's Office Crime Lab for analysis. The serology department did a preliminary examination to confirm that the blood was human. The specimens were then sent to criminalist Reno to determine if viable DNA could be extracted from them.
We really didn't expect to get results. The stains themselves looked like something that came from the bottom of a charcoal grill. And high heat is something that can ruin DNA.
In fact, the heat had been very destructive. But despite temperatures in excess of 1,400 degrees, Romero was able to extract DNA from 3 of the 11 samples. The next step in profiling the blood droplets was RFLP, the most complex DNA test. It's most often used when the sample is in bad condition or is too minute. By exposing the DNA to radiation and using a series of radioactive tags, a DNA profile can be determined. The test took 3 months to perform. The RFLP process worked on only 1 of the 3 DNA samples. The bar pattern it generated was then compared to that of the blood drawn from James Manassas.
Was 1 in 500.
Romero's statistics estimated that the frequency of this particular genetic pattern is 1 in 500,000. The population of Reno is just over 80,000. The slim but powerful DNA evidence had survived the crucible of a devastating fire and bound James Manassas to his hostile act. To Bernie's way of thinking, Manassas was a man who wanted attention for his crime and sympathy for his wife. It seemed like he was a man with an agenda.
Basically, I think he was playing with us, or myself, to see how long he could prolong being arrested, and he wanted to be noticed. He was a vigilante. He wanted everybody in the world of the city of Reno to think that his wife, who was being treated at the mental health facility, wasn't being treated correctly.
For his crime of arson and the shooting attack on the clinic, James Manassas received 76 years in jail. With a gallon of gasoline and a match, Manassas' stunt evolved into an enormously costly crime, totaling $4.5 million. Fortunately, the fire claimed no victims. The ultimate price is paid when fires turn fatal. Shortly after midnight on February 14, 1985, the the Pittsburgh Fire Department was dispatched to 8361 Bryceland Street. Captain Thomas Brooks, firefighter Patricia Conroy, and firefighter Mark Colenda entered the house and made their way down a staircase to the basement. When the stairwell collapsed, they found themselves trapped with no apparent way out. The intense heat and blinding smoke prevented them from finding an exit. Their hose burned in half. Their radios failed. As the fire continued to rage, the oxygen in their tanks ran out. It took several hours to extinguish the blaze and evacuate the fallen firefighters from the incinerated home. Brooks, Conroy, and Colenda could not be revived. None of the Buckner family, who rented this house, were injured in the fire. Because the fire turned fatal, the Pittsburgh fire inspector contacted the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Special Agents Dan Bay and his partner Bill Petratus were assigned to the case.
Anytime you have a situation where 3 firefighters die or a firefighter dies, it's a very high priority with ATF as far as the investigations go. They requested us in the early part of the investigation, actually right after the fire, to make a determination on the cause of the fire.
The agents tried to discover how these firefighters had died. The house, typical of the Pittsburgh area, appeared to be 2 stories from the front, but was actually 4 stories, built into a hill. This layout contributed to the firefighters' disorientation. They failed to notice their passage to safety.
They didn't realize that this door could be opened. They thought it was a dead-end closet, so this access was blocked. Their exit route, following the route they used to come in, was blocked because of the collapse.
Blinded by smoke, the firefighters felt around the walls, searching for exit windows. When they couldn't find any indentations, they believed they were trapped underground. What they couldn't know, as their air supplies dwindled, was that the room had several windows, but they had been weatherproofed and covered with heavy plexiglass. The fire was too hot for other firefighters to come to their rescue, and there was no way to contact them. The 3 firefighters could not be saved. Investigators now had to determine how the fire started. ATF agents surveyed the wreckage. The majority of it was in the basement and attic. This suggested that the fire began in the basement. Then, having extinguished all combustible materials on that level, leapt up to the attic through the spaces between the walls. The absence of frayed wires or damage to the inside of the washer, dryer, water heater, or furnace dispelled the theory that the fire could have been sparked by an electrical glitch. A pile of charred laundry sat in the middle of the soaked floor. When investigators turned their attention upwards, they noticed an odd burn pattern directly above the burned laundry. The marks aroused the suspicions of investigator Dan Petratus.
The joists of the ceiling were burned out in a circular pattern that was probably about 12 feet in diameter. That is unusual. So that was one of our early indicators that something occurred in the basement that wasn't typical of a naturally occurring fire.
To understand the fire's progression, the ATF team relied on a series of mathematical formulas. By plugging the values for burning textiles into the formula, Petratus determined that a pile of laundry of that size would generate 176 kilowatts of energy.
Got anything to seal this with?
Yeah,
probably 12-foot drop-off.
That figure was then factored into a flame height formula.
This is a shot down that stairwell.
It calculated that the maximum flame height would be only 2.5 feet.
It can then be placed in other...
The flame wouldn't even reach the ceiling, let alone leave such a large burn pattern.
How we could have a fire that would extend... So when we look at a particular fire scene and we interpret the patterns, then the next question we ask ourselves is, does the fuel load that we find in this room have enough energy to create the patterns that we're observing? We need a flame height.
Even if the laundry were piled up to the ceiling, it wouldn't create a great enough flame to mushroom out and ignite the joists simultaneously. But factor an accelerant into the equation, and the picture changes.
The calculator says 1,300 kilowatts.
By adding a single gallon of gasoline to the laundry pile, the flame height increases to 13 feet. This model fit the burn pattern on the ceilings and the joists. There was no way that a laundry pile could fuel a fire powerful enough to burn the ceiling unless it had been enhanced with an accelerant.
When we plug in a material that has the characteristics and energy of gasoline, then that particular material will create the patterns that we have observed.
Petratus had located the origin of the fire and determined that an accelerant had been at work there. But collecting evidence to prove his case would be difficult. Burned shreds of laundry had been soaking in water for hours. The basement floor was made of concrete. Because it's non-flammable, it doesn't yield a discernible pore pattern.
That's enough. Why don't you get that back to the lab?
If this case were to be solved, the story would be told in the lab. The ATF lab in Rockville, Maryland was called upon to analyze samples of laundry, wood, and some cement chips from the floor of the house that burned in Pittsburgh. Forensic chemist William Kennard examined the debris from the fire for traces of accelerant.
When a fireman sends us some debris, and he's looking for an accelerating compound, and he petitions us to try to find this accelerating compound from the debris that he sent in. So we use the charcoal strip method.
The test involves the insertion of a charcoal-coated strip into the canister, held in place by a magnet. The can is then heated to about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. If hydrocarbon molecules, the main compound of accelerants, are present, they are captured by the charcoal. The strip is dissolved in carbon disulfide, and the resulting solution is injected into a gas chromatograph. The instrument displays a chemical profile of the substance. Kennard then compares the pattern of peaks and valleys to a standard for evaporated gasoline. If the patterns match, gasoline is present on the sample. Kennard found remnants of the accelerant in 6 of the samples from Bryceland Street. His identification of gasoline in the pile of laundry corroborated the scenario of arson. A fire started when a pile of laundry on the basement floor had been doused with gasoline and ignited. Now, the investigation focused on finding out who did it and why.
And your name?
Catherine.
The ATF first questioned the homeowner, but he had nothing to gain by the destruction of his home. The ATF suspected that the Bryceland Street fire might have been gang-related, but that seemed a dead end. They then contacted Ronald and Darlene Buckner, who rented the house. The focus soon turned to the Buckner's daughter, Catherine.
everybody's...
When we looked into her background, she had been involved with 2 other residents in the past year and a half that had basement fires. So she became a very strong suspect, and we considered her for probably 6 to 7 months of investigation before she was eliminated as the suspect.
As they continued their investigation, the ATF learned that the Buckners aspired to buy a house. In the summer of 1994, Ronald and Darlene had gone to look at homes with several real estate agents. In October of that year, they inquired several times about purchasing houses, but were turned down each time because they couldn't afford a down payment. In November, after 5 years without coverage, the Buckners took out a renter's insurance policy on the Bryceland Street house. Only 3 months later, the house was gutted by fire. The insurance company paid $20,000 on their claim. What the company failed to notice was that the day after the fire, the Buckners resumed their house hunting with new enthusiasm. As soon as they received a check from the insurance company, they put a down payment on a new house, one that they'd been eyeing since the previous year. A motive was taking shape. Investigators grew increasingly suspicious of Darlene Buckner and her son, Gregory Brown. Darlene said that on the night of the fire, she and Gregory had gone grocery shopping. They returned to find her house engulfed in flames. Yet neighbors had seen Gregory Brown standing outside his home, watching it burn, even before emergency crews were on the scene. Another neighbor had seen Darlene driving her car near the grocery store alone that night. Shortly after the fire, Gregory had been arrested on drug charges. He had served 90 days. ATF agents interviewed his cellmates. They told the ATF that Gregory bragged about setting the fire that killed 3 people and landed his family in a new house.
Yeah, actually showing that the temperature...
The ATF filed charges against Gregory Brown and Darlene Buckner. All the scientific evidence pointed to arson. Fire setters unleash a force far beyond their control. By dropping a match in a gasoline-soaked pile of laundry, Gregory Brown set in motion a chain of events that claimed 3 lives. The jury found Gregory Brown guilty of 3 counts of second-degree murder, 2 counts of arson, and insurance fraud. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in prison. Darlene Buckner was found guilty of insurance fraud, but was acquitted of the other charges. She was sentenced to 3 years and probation and fined $5,000. Defying the arsonist's intentions, a history of the crime is forever etched in the scorched and blistered rubble left behind. Through computer modeling, trained dogs, chemical analysis, and astute observation, forensic investigators are able to reconstruct the crime and read the story from its ashes. Investigators race to stop a serial bomber who sends his deadly parcels by mail. 3 people have been killed. And no one knows how many more packages are en route to their targets. In California, experts match wits with a terrorist bent on crippling the Internal Revenue Service. For 5 years, his bombs have confounded authorities. Sheer luck has prevented injuries, but sheer skill is what's needed to catch him. Beneath the rubble, the terrorist leaves a calling card that experts are learning to read. In bomb investigations, forensics means the difference between feeling safe and living in terror. Fear is the terrorist's greatest ally. To achieve his ends, he doesn't care who dies. He can strike anywhere, anytime. And though his crimes are carefully plotted, their effect seems horribly random. When bombs are his weapon of choice, he can kill from a distance. In Birmingham, Alabama, 2 weeks before Christmas 1989, Helen Vance accepted a package addressed to her husband, Robert. Federal Judge Robert Vance came in from his yard work to find the package on the table where his wife was wrapping gifts. Believing it contained magazines he'd been waiting for, he cut the string and opened the box. He was killed instantly. When paramedics arrived on the scene, they tried to help Helen Vance, who was standing nearby when the bomb exploded. She was temporarily deafened from the blast and in shock, unable to speak. Forensic experts rushed to the scene to investigate. They collected nails embedded in the walls and ceiling, shards of steel pipe, and the remnants of the package itself. The explosion had hurled the shrapnel up to 3,600 miles per hour. Each fragment was carefully cataloged. Only the most meticulous work would allow authorities to catch a killer who struck from a distance. And that killer wasn't stopping. 150 miles away in Atlanta, 2 days after Judge Vance was killed, a package arrived at the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, addressed to the clerk's office. A routine X-ray revealed the ominous silhouette of a pipe bomb. Before the shocked security officers could stop it, the package dropped to the floor. The officers immediately evacuated the building and called bomb technicians. An alert posted after the death of Judge Vance described the device that killed him. The Atlanta bomb resembled the one in Birmingham. Though Vance's bomb was rigged to explode when the package was opened, the bomb techs had to assume this one could blow at any moment. The drop from the conveyor belt and routine handling in the post office could have rendered it unstable. Their Kevlar suits, 3 inches thick and weighing 80 pounds, provide safety only at a distance. If the tech is close to the detonation, the pressure from the blast would crush him. The first step was to photograph and X-ray the bomb to study its components. The X-rays revealed no timing device, so the techs breathed a little easier.
I think the switch is going to be all right. We know the bomb.
There was no reason to rush. Unless a bomb is rigged to a timer or strapped to a victim, bomb removal typically takes hours. Every step was planned, every motion rehearsed. As each maneuver was carefully completed, the bomb techs paused to ventilate their smothering suits and modify their strategy. As a precaution, the area around the building was kept clear of pedestrians and traffic. Throughout the delicate operation, their hands remained uncovered to assure they kept a secure grip. Once they were certain the bomb was stable, they lowered it into a bin and put it in an armored trailer. Police cars and motorcycles cleared a safe area around the vehicle. The convoy took the least populated route to the bomb range at the city landfill. The package was rendered safe, but this second bomb in 2 days had enormous impact. It suggested a serial bomber. Alcohol, tobacco, and firearms Special Agent Brian Hoback was assigned to the case.
You got to remember who the targets were. 1, a judge, a federal judge. 2, people at the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals who had nothing to do with the judicial system other than administrative matters.
But the bomber wasn't through. On December 18th, the same day the Atlanta bomb was deactivated, attorney Robbie Robinson received a package in Savannah, 250 miles away. Like Judge Vance, Robinson had no reason to suspect anything sinister about the package sitting on his desk a week before Christmas. In an instant, he became the killer's second victim. Investigators mapped out the direction of the explosion to better estimate the size of the bomb. They set up a grid and began the tedious task of collecting even the tiniest shreds of evidence.
When investigators go to a crime scene, they're looking for physical evidence. That evidence in a bombing scene is everywhere. It's on the ceilings, it's on the ground, it's in the walls, it's in the furniture, it's in the victim's body, it's on the victim's clothing. First, we photograph. Then we grid the room so that we know exactly where that piece of evidence came from and we can articulate that to a jury. We got down on our hands and knees and collected that evidence, sifted it, stick it over a screen, shake the debris to see if we can't find components of whatever the device was that exploded. In that particular case, it was a pipe bomb inside of a cardboard box.
One of the more insidious aspects of the bomb was the fact that dozens of nails, seen here in X-rays of the victim's body, were packed around the pipe, increasing the deadliness of the explosion. These nails matched those from Judge Vance's bomb and the package intercepted at the courthouse in Atlanta. The wrapping, found almost intact in Robinson's trash can, was also comparable to the other bombs. With 3 bombs in 2 days, time was precious. Agent Hoback and his multi-agency team struggled to find a link between the 3 targets. Why would someone single out this particular lawyer, judge, and court building? The bombing seemed like random strikes against the legal system. If that were true, the bomber would be hard to predict and harder to catch. They couldn't anticipate who the next victim might be, and it was likely that the bomb was already in the mail.
His shot is peeled backwards on that.
In the lab, experts studied the nails, pieces of pipe, bits of wire, and package remnants collected from the exploded bombs. They took inventory of the most minute details. Barely perceptible markings, fragments of logos, tiny pieces of packaging, all may lead to manufacturers or retail outlets or directly to a killer. But in this case, the items surviving the blast were too generic to tell them anything. The bomber continued with his deadly plan. Fortunately, Jacksonville, Florida NAACP President Willie Dennis was too busy to open her mail on December 18th. Learning of Robinson's death in Savannah and warned by her friends to be wary of any packages, she called her secretary the next day to advise him not to open the parcel on her desk.
What she later did was call the sheriff's department down there in Jacksonville and requested them to look at a package that to her seemed somewhat suspicious.
The technicians noted it was identical to packages used in the previous bombings. They photographed and x-rayed it to see if their suspicions were justified.
You got a power supply, you got wires going into an unknown dense substance.
The x-rays disclosed a device that matched the other bombs, so investigators had the advantage of knowing what they were dealing with. The technicians used a mechanical device to disable its firing system. The package had been successfully ripped apart. Still wary of an explosion, technicians carefully pulled the unexploded pipe bomb from the office while maintaining a cautious distance. It was brought to a bomb range, studied, rendered safe, and carefully dismantled. Left behind in the office were the now familiar nails and brown paper with red and white mailing labels. Like most mail bombers, this one affixed more than enough postage to assure his package was delivered. This parcel also contained something surprising, a roll of hate mail. It included a copy of a threatening letter sent to a Jacksonville television station. The postmark linked it to an Atlanta post office. So now the agents knew the bomb was probably sent from Georgia. The physical evidence was building. These strongly worded letters put right-wing fringe groups high on the list of suspects. The ATF assembled a task force to outsmart the bomber. Terry Pelfrey, a bomb technician with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, was called into the group's monthly lunch meeting.
My role in the investigation was to first look at right-wing groups that were located in Georgia. These included the Ku Klux Klan, the Aryan Nation members, Christian Identity Church Movement members, and skinheads. We had informants in each of these groups. Some of the informants ranked as high as Grand Dragons in these groups, which were the leaders of the Ku Klux Klan. There was no talk within the right-wing movement groups that would give us any indication of bomb suspects in these groups.
At the December 19th meeting, an ATF agent outlined the similarities among the recent bombing incidents.
after considerable effort. Did you see anything you recognized?
He passed around pictures of the bomb recovered at the courthouse and described what he knew of its construction.
The device consists of a pipe bomb with flat welded end plates.
The description struck a spark of recognition for ATF bomb expert Lloyd Irwin. The bombs resembled one he saw in 1972. Though he had inspected more than 3,000 bombs in his career, he had a feeling this was the work of the same bomber.
The minute I looked at it, I saw some characteristics of this bomb that reminded me of the 1972 bomb. That being that it had square end plates held with a bolt through the center. I only had one bolt, but still it was the same technique.
How about drawing me a picture?
He hadn't seen another like it in more than 15 years. From memory, Irwin sketched the 1972 bomb.
You learn that the guy, even though he changes his technique, if he's made them before, he'll keep something similar because he knows it worked before. Why trash it when he can make it work again? So he might modify it, but he'll still have some similarities of something that he's done before.
Did we get him?
Yeah.
For Irwin, the construction of the devices bore the signature of the 1972 bomber. Right after the meeting, he called Special Agent Hoback.
So Lloyd Irwin called me back at the office to advise me that he had seen only one other device like this in all the years that he had been involved in these types of investigations, and he gave me the name of the man who had been convicted of possessing that device in 1972. That man's name was Walter Leroy Moody.
Roy Moody had been convicted of building a bomb he intended to send to the man who had repossessed his car. The bomb's real victim, however, was Moody's wife, Hazel, who inadvertently opened the package, injuring her hand and eye and severely burning her face. Roy Moody went to prison, and Hazel was granted a divorce. The ATF began taking a closer look at Roy Moody.
We eliminate suspects by different things. Motive might be one way to eliminate them, whether their presence was actually in the area. There's a number of ways to eliminate suspects. However, what we were doing with other suspects by eliminating them, we could not do with Walter Leroy Moody.
At this point, most of the evidence linking Moody to the bombings was circumstantial. The investigators now had to positively link the components of the bombs to the suspected bomber. For that, they relied on the ATF Forensics Lab in Atlanta. By analyzing the chemical composition of the detonators and primers, experts determined who manufactured them. Fortunately, the company had very limited distribution in the Southeast. The manufacturer provided a list of the stores that sold their product. Meanwhile, the ATF noted further similarities between Moody's 1972 bomb and the recent ones. All used cardboard boxes, metal pipes with square end caps and a rod, flashlight batteries, and flashlight bulbs. So investigators would have more first-hand information. Specialists recreated and detonated the bombs. When powder packed inside a sealed pipe is ignited, it quickly converts from solid to gas. The resulting pressure is enormous. In an instant, the pipe bursts, sending razor-sharp fragments of steel and nails in all directions at deadly speed. Whoever built these bombs went to great lengths to maximize their destructive power. They were made for only one purpose: to kill. A behavioral profile described the killer as a white male, working and living alone or with one other person, disciplined, educated, self-structured, meticulous, and cowardly. He believed his current job was beneath him. Presented with that profile, Terry Pelfrey recognized the precise description of the man he had been investigating, Roy Moody.
Bill Hagmeyer with the FBI did the psychological profiling. He did not know Walter Leroy Moody at all. And so I sat during the meetings with Mr. Hagmeyer. He read the psychological profile that he had written up, and he wrote Mr. Moody's life story in that profile. It was really rather scary.
The weight of the combined evidence was enough to obtain a search warrant. On February 8th, investigators searched Moody's house. They uncovered law books and transcripts of Moody's 1972 bomb trial.
As we found in his transcripts during this search warrant, the highlighted areas where we matched forensically the evidence from the explosive site to the evidence that was found within his home and his workshop. All that matched in 1972, so in 1989, Mr. Moody gets smarter. He thinks he gets smarter.
But it was the clues detectives failed to find that raised their suspicions further.
We knew that Mr. Moody kept his books from school because he had his law books. However, he didn't have his chemistry books. We also did not find the weapons that apparently Mr. Moody owned. We knew he owned some because he had ammunition in the front seat of his pickup truck. So where were those weapons?
Following a lead, investigators secured permission to search the basement of a house in Chamblee, Georgia, where Moody rented storage space. They found a pipe with caps screwed onto each end. The caps had holes drilled through them, and one of the ends had a nut welded atop it, ready for a rod to be threaded through.
Ask the owner, see if we can get a picture
One of the investigators on the scene was ATF Special Agent David Heitch.
All ATF agents are trained in our basic school to identify improvised explosive devices, and the most basic and most commonly used improvised explosive device in this country is a pipe bomb. And so when you see a pipe nipple with end caps affixed, I automatically think that potentially we've got a pipe bomb.
Heitch took the pipe to chemist Lloyd Irwin, who suspected Roy Moody's handiwork early in the investigation. Irwin scraped the pipe in search of explosive residue. His analysis yielded only rust. The pipe may have been a prototype, but agents had no way to prove it. They just didn't have enough to make their case. In their search for more evidence in the mail bombings, investigators went to stores that sold the brand of primers used in the bombs. Their hunt led them to the Shootin' Iron gun shop in Griffin, Georgia. An employee remembered selling a 4-pound keg of Red Dot smokeless powder and 4,000 handgun primers in December of 1989. The large purchase stuck in his mind. Red Dot was the powder used in the December bombs, and 3,200 primers were needed to fire them. In a photo lineup, the clerk chose Roy Moody as the customer. Investigators felt they had their man. On July 10, 1990, Roy Moody was arrested and held without bail. Police also brought into custody his wife, Susan, as a possible accomplice. She was permitted a bond. Susan Moody was allowed to plead guilty to a lesser charge of conspiracy in exchange for her complete cooperation. She told investigators how she had been a servant to Roy almost since the day they met in 1981. She said Roy taught her to cover her trail, use disguises, buy materials, and mail packages far from home. She also offered the name of Roy's former cellmate. When investigators searched his house, they found footlockers with Moody's name on them. They contained the missing guns and chemistry books. Agents also found ammunition, a bomb diagram, and an arc welding unit. Susan Moody's testimony was crucial to cracking the case.
She pretty much put everything together for us. We had bits and pieces all throughout the investigation of why Moody did this, how he did this, to what extent he did the bombings the same way that he did in 1972 as far as their construction. However, Mrs. Moody actually told us how he went about the process and how the process began with the motive.
And what was that motive? Roy Moody had a history of frivolous litigation. Most of his cases were thrown out of court. He was desperate to become a lawyer so he could fix what he considered to be a flawed system. But he was denied the bar exam because of his 1972 felony conviction for creating the bomb that injured his first wife. When he failed to have the conviction overturned, Moody swore revenge against the judicial system. He started with Judge Robert Vance, who had written an opinion denying his appeal. Moody was caught through dedicated investigative work, detailed forensics, and the sharp memory of bomb investigator Lloyd Irwin.
We have a computer system at ATF that matches up bomb components, and it's a very valuable computer system, and we're continuously refining that computer system. It's amazing what it can do. You can enter the components you have from a device, and it will tell you if there have ever been any similar devices constructed. Well, in this particular case, Lloyd beat the computer. I mean, there's no substitute for experience like Lloyd has.
The legal system that Roy Moody felt had failed him did not fail the citizens he terrorized. In June 1991, the jury sentenced him to 7 life terms plus 400 years, later changed to the death penalty. Moody's twisted agenda relied on the U.S. mail to deliver his bombs to specific people. But other terrorists are not so particular about who they murder. The Oklahoma City bombing was thought to be a strike against government. In the process of destroying the building, 168 citizens were killed. When a terrorist targets the government, there's no predicting how or when he'll attack. In the early morning hours of February 22, 1990, the West Los Angeles Fire Department answered a routine call to douse a burning truck around the corner from their station. But this was no standard vehicle fire. The truck, parked in front of an office building, contained 5 55-gallon barrels and clusters of pipes in its bed, all tilted toward the building. The pipes were improvised mortars designed to lob pipe bombs. Some had already launched. To keep the barrels from rupturing, firefighters used gentle pressure to cool them and extinguish the fire. Bomb technicians were called in. Members of the Los Angeles Police Department bomb squad rushed to the scene. As they suited up, firefighters explained what they had found. Bomb Squad Detective Joe Powell realized that a huge catastrophe was narrowly averted.
The fire department described that the drums were cherry red hot because of the fire, and they put the fire out with the water hose that they normally use. The fire department was extremely lucky that the device did not detonate on them when they were putting the fire out.
Powell's primary concern was to be sure there were no secondary devices, so he checked the 5th floor, where windows had been broken by the homemade mortar rounds. The bombs penetrated the office of the IRS, which occupied the 5th floor, but damage was minimal. Then he and his partner cautiously approached the truck. They needed to determine whether the truck was booby-trapped, since their first priority is to keep people from getting hurt.
Once the area was evacuated, we went up and took individual samples out of each drum, analyzed them at the scene visually, and then sent them back to the lab for a scientific evaluation to see what the chemical structure was.
The contents of the barrels were sent to the lab. Using a gas chromatograph, the samples were broken down into their chemical components. The tests determined that the substance inside the barrels was ANFO, an unstable mixture of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil. The truck contained more than 200 gallons of ANFO. To understand the destructive potential of that much explosive, the LAPD performed a test explosion in the California desert. They filled a pickup truck with a combination of ANFO and TNT to simulate the conditions at the IRS building. The truck had been obliterated. Wreckage littered the desert floor. Nothing recognizable was left behind. In an urban setting, the damage from such an explosion would have been colossal, says FBI Special Agent Nick Boone.
That is almost the equivalent of 1,600 pounds of TNT. This is a high explosive. The blast would have gone out in all directions and done extreme damage for many blocks. The only thing that would have made it more devastating is had this same truck been confined as if in the parking garage, the effect would have been something like Oklahoma City.
In fact, the parking garage was the scene of a potential bombing less than 2 years earlier. In that case, too, disaster was narrowly averted. The IRS building had been the target of bombings before. In September 1988, the basement parking garage was the scene of the first incident. Detective Powell and the bomb squad disarmed a 1971 Toyota at this address. It contained a water heater filled with ANFO. It also had a booby trap under the rear tire. When tripped, the car burst into flames. As the fire department extinguished it, they found pipe bombs in the trunk. Bomb squad technicians determined that gasoline cans and plastic detergent bottles in the back seat were filled with ammonia and bleach. They were designed to fill the garage with poisonous fumes. The bombs were deactivated without incident. The car had been reported stolen from the parking lot of Ford Aerospace, but there the trail grew cold. But not for long. 6 months later, a routine line check by the power company uncovered pipe bombs attached to 4 high-voltage power poles behind the same building. the bombs detonated, causing minor damage. The IRS building in West LA wasn't the bomber's only target. The power line bombs resembled one found 8 months earlier, about 50 miles away. An electronic detonator and ANFO were attached to the base of a power pole servicing the IRS building in Laguna Niguel, California. It was rendered harmless by the bomb squad. It was clear the bombings were related. These attacks and bombings in other buildings dating back to 1986 led to the formation of a multi-agency task force on terrorism. It found that the circuitry in all the bombs was similar. FBI Special Agent Frank Bhakti was a case agent for the task force.
All explosive devices, especially serial bomber explosive devices, have a specific signature or type of construction unique to the bomb maker. And if you could examine a series of unexplained bombings, you can examine the way the bombs are put together and make a fairly educated guess as to whether one person might be responsible based upon the way the bombs are constructed.
Besides the design similarities, all the bombings shared a common target, the Internal Revenue Service.
We began investigating in several directions. One was to try and find other similar bombings that were committed in this area and to see who was either convicted of those bombings or suspected. We also went in the direction of states' rights, anti-government, anti-IRS groups, because they would logically be the kind of people that might attack the buildings and go after IRS.
A potential lead arrived in the mail. In letters sent to the newspaper and to the IRS building, a group calling itself Up the IRS Incorporated claimed responsibility for the truck bombing, as it had the 1988 car bomb attack. Boone considered the letter authentic, as it contained information about the bomb not made public. The envelopes were addressed by hand, giving investigators a writing sample, but they had nothing to compare it against. A more immediately helpful clue was a digital watch used as a timing device. Investigators believed the bomber was trying to show off his high-tech skills, but to no avail. The alarm on the watch used to ignite the truck bomb wasn't set properly, so the device didn't detonate as planned. Even so, the circuitry of the bombs provided the first clear lead. Many components were built exclusively for the military and were unavailable on the street. That suggested the bomber had some contact with the high-tech industry. The fact that the car used in the garage bombing in 1988 was stolen from the parking lot at Ford Aerospace gave LAPD Detective Bob Nelson an avenue to pursue.
We learned later on in the investigation as we went through the components that there were certain identifiable wires and electronic components that were directly attributed to the Ford Aerospace location. However, there was no estimate as to when they were actually utilized. There was no date or any way to tell if it was an old surplus item or something current.
Nelson and Boone were certain the bomber was a past or present employee of Ford Aerospace. But the company employs thousands. The detectives had no way of narrowing the pool. Thanks to the swift action of the West Los Angeles Fire Department, one of the most pivotal clues was preserved. The serial number from the truck used in the 1990 bombing was traced to its last registered owners. Mr. and Mrs. Orozco had sold it for $500 in December of 1989.
Okay, does it run?
According to Mr. Orozco, the buyer hardly spoke, asked few questions, and seemed anxious to leave. He didn't haggle over the price, and he paid cash. name he signed on the title form was James T. Harmon. Police knew that if they found Harmon, they'd find the bomber. But what did he look like? A police artist brought an identikit to the Orozcos to create a composite sketch.
Oh yeah. It was.
There was some balding going on.
It contains hundreds of overlays of generic facial features.
The style, straight.
By mixing and matching, the artist slowly fashioned a likeness of the suspect that the witnesses were satisfied with. An initial check with FBI, ATF, and LAPD files came up empty. In the meantime, the bomber struck again. On the morning of March 31st, 1991, mortar fire buffeted the parking lot and roof of the IRS Service Center in Fresno, California. No one was hurt. The 13 missiles were launched from a vacant lot, where investigators collected extension cords, wiring, and crumpled newspaper used as packing. They also picked up a digital watch timing device and aerospace circuitry. Agent Boone knew the same bomber was responsible, and he knew he and Detective Nelson were getting closer to catching him.
I took one look at it, saw many of our components, and knew this is our bomber again. This is our serial bomber. But this time he slipped up, and we got the major break of the case. One of those components was what we call a heat sink. It's simply a piece of metal that disperses heat.
Boone believed the specialized component was probably made by Ford Aerospace. He needed to learn more about it, but everyone at the plant was a potential suspect. Who could he trust? Discreet inquiries about the component brought him nothing. Frustrated, getting nowhere, he showed it to the assembly engineer, taking the chance he wasn't the bomber.
He walked down one corridor, turned the corner, walked down another, reached into a bin, and handed me an identical heat sink. I can't tell you what the feeling was like at that point. It was the most exciting part of the case ever, and I also began to look around quite concerned that I'm now standing here with the heat sink in my hand, and there's every possibility that the bomber is 2 tables away, is on the assembly line, is the engineer around the corner. We got out of there about as fast as we could get away from the assembly line and back off the floor.
Although identifying numbers had been filed off, the components were ringed with red paint. The engineer explained that meant they were defective and pulled off the line. This considerably narrowed down the possible areas at Ford Aerospace.
Only 84 of them were ever manufactured, and 9 of them only had been pulled off the line as defective. So now we really had 4 of 9 in the entire world.
Hello, sir. Thanks for seeing us.
Investigators brought the composite sketch to the manager of the engineering lab, the most likely source of the heat sink. The manager didn't recognize the face and didn't know a James Harmon. Who was this man? Detectives knew they were getting close, but the identity of their bomber still eluded them. How soon before he struck again? How soon before he killed someone? As their search for the bomber continued, Agent Boone and Detective Nelson received a call from the lab manager. After thinking about it, he did in fact recognize the face in the police sketch. It bore a resemblance to an engineer in the large-scale inspection lab. It looked like a man named Dean Harvey Hicks. The investigators raced back to Ford Aerospace. At his desk, they found anti-IRS cartoons, and in his employee file were writing samples that matched the handwriting on the envelopes of the letters that claimed responsibility.
Once we reached a part of the investigation where we were at Ford Aerospace, and Nick Boone pulled open the personnel file and made the comparison with the photograph and the handprinting and handwriting, we knew that Dean Harvey Hicks was our suspect.
Digging deeper, agents learned that on January 17, 1990, a man named James T. Harmon purchased 700 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, the main ingredient of ANFO, at the Orange County Farm Supply Company. James T. Harmon was the name on the DMV form submitted after the purchase of the truck used in the 1990 bombing. The handwriting on the receipt matched that of Dean Harvey Hicks. Incriminating handwriting was also found at the scene of the Fresno bombing, placing Hicks at the scene.
He had figured on some newspaper how far his mortar bombs would fire, how much powder would send the bomb how far, and he had worked this out on this piece of newspaper. He then wadded that up and actually used it for packing in the Fresno device. We had that also. When we straightened that out and were able to look at the numbers on a flat surface, we were able to actually also match those to his handwriting.
Agent Boone and Detective Nelson tallied the evidence. Hicks had been off work when each of the bombs was planted. He had access to all of the items linked to Ford Aerospace. He matched the description of the purchaser of the truck used in 1990, and his handwriting matched the letters claiming responsibility. But detectives didn't know if he was acting alone. Before they arrested him, they kept an eye on him.
Surveillance continued while the arrest warrant and search warrants were being prepared, while we looked into his past to determine whether or not there was other people involved with him. At a point in the investigation, we believed that there may be some interest in him constructing another device. We initiated the search warrant and the arrest warrant the following day.
His arrest came on July 11, 1991. Hicks was brought to a hotel room for interview. There, he seemed pleased to provide details about the bombings. He especially liked to answer technical questions the investigators could not figure out.
By the time we had finished the interview, Dean Hicks had made a complete confession and described to us in great detail how he put together and delivered most of the bombs. He actually had some loss of recollection on some of them because it was just too long ago, but he was incredibly detailed on all of the more recent bombings, how he meticulously put them together and how he constructed them and how he delivered them to the site.
While Boone and Nelson interviewed Hicks, forensics experts searched his house and garage. There, they found bombs in progress, circuits, ammonium nitrate, and false ID bearing the name of James T. Harmon. The story became very clear. His co-workers at Ford Aerospace knew that Dean Harvey Hicks despised the IRS. But they didn't know he was stealing parts from the workplace in order to attack the government agency. In 1981, Hicks had claimed an $8,500 income tax deduction, a contribution to an organization that the IRS did not consider nonprofit. It denied the deduction. Hicks claimed that the IRS employee he spoke with laughed at him, so he used his electronics expertise to exact his revenge. Though he claimed to be part of a group, the Task Force on Terrorism determined that Hicks acted alone.
Organized groups are not always responsible for acts of domestic terrorism. One person can do just as much damage with a little bit of explosive knowledge as an entire terrorist organization. And I think in the past, we would always tend to look at the organized terrorist organizations being responsible for some of the acts. I think Mr. Hicks has shown everyone that one person acting alone can be just as deadly and just as dangerous as a large group.
As clever as Dean Harvey Hicks was, the tireless efforts of investigators like Agent Nick Boone and Detective Bob Nelson finally ended his reign of terror. Finding him guilty on 4 counts of using destructive devices against a federal facility, a jury sentenced Hicks to 20 years in prison. Ironically, he was also ordered to pay more than $335,000 to the Internal Revenue Service. The crimes of Dean Hicks and Roy Moody were personal vendettas disguised as political statements. Like all acts of terrorism, the senseless deeds of these desperate men accomplished nothing. Despite its mystique, terrorism is a crime like any other. And like all crimes, the perpetrator can't help but leave clues behind. With each new case, forensic detectives refine their ability to trace those clues back to the criminal.